Hey guys, my name's Tom Froese. I'm an illustrator and a top teacher on Skillshare, where I've helped tens of thousands of students unlock the world of commercial illustration. Welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to talk about 14 mistakes illustrators make when working with clients. So, are you constantly fighting and losing creative battles? Are you constantly frustrated by clients who don't trust you or can't seem to make up their minds? Your art might not be the problem. Perhaps you're just going about the process with too much focus on the art and not enough emphasis on communicating with and including your clients along the way. Are you making any of the following mistakes? By avoiding these, you'll have more success in seeing your ideas come to life and more success earning that much needed trust you need from your client to do your job. So this video turned out to be a bit of a doozy. There are 14 points to go through and I kind of went deep into each. So it is a bit of a longer video. Hopefully you're up for it. Make yourself a cup of coffee and settle in. But yeah, this is really part of my next class that I'm writing, which is about illustrating for clients. And so I'm workshopping some of the ideas and this list of these mistakes that we make as illustrators working with clients and what to do about them is just part of that thinking. So I really covet your feedback if you have any on the content in this video. And I especially want to hear your experiences as illustrators working for clients. What are your big pain points? So as I'm going through these points, I'd love to know what your thoughts are on each of these, or if you have anything else to add. So let's just get into the points. So the first mistake is starting without a proper brief. So this may seem obvious, but it's very important to know what your job is before starting any work. The only way you'll know your role is by writing up a full brief. A brief is an exercise in learning exactly what your job is before you begin. A brief establishes the purpose for the art and gives you specific objectives to aim for. It gives you a starting point for creativity and it gives you the necessary structure to keep you on track the whole way through. So without a brief, you're going into a project blind. It's like going on a long adventure without a mission or a map. You're gonna get lost or worse. And during hard times, you're not going to know why you should even bother pushing through. So what does the brief look like? Well, it can be a formal set of questions that the client has to answer as sort of a questionnaire, or it can be more of an informal process of piecing together the information over a series of conversations. In my experience, briefs come together more in parts than all at once. Usually a client will initiate a conversation by telling me a very quick summary of what they need and checking my availability. This is the first step. From there, I respond with follow-up questions just to learn as much as I can about the job before I can express full interest. It's a good idea to get as much information as you can before committing to a project. You wouldn't want to say yes to a job only to find out after that it's actually not what you thought. You might end up taking on a job you won't really enjoy, or worse, it might put you in way over your head. It might turn out, say, that the deadline is too aggressive, or maybe they're asking for more work or more value than they can actually afford with their budget. Make sure you have a full brief before you start a job. In fact, you should have as full of a brief as you can before even quoting or accepting the job in the first place. A full and proper brief is the only way to do your job right and to avoid pain and frustration along the way. If you want to learn more about conducting briefs, I found a really helpful article. It's like really old, it's like from 2012, but it's surprisingly helpful. I'll leave it in the show links, in the video links. And yeah, if you're looking for it, like what are the right questions to ask, that's a great starting point. The next mistake is not having clear check-in points with the client. So sometimes a client will ask me up front, what's your illustration process like? The first few times I was asked this question, I actually thought they were curious about my artistic process. But looking back, I think what they really wanted to know was how we would work together. What were the check-in points during the process? What will they see first? What will they see in the final art? What opportunities do they have for feedback? So in order to know what these check-in points are, you first need to know your own creative process and when you feel you most need the client's input. Then you can clearly communicate these important touch points to your client. From there, you can work these into a schedule, and the client will more patiently wait for these deadlines, these touch points, without wondering what's going on over there. You'll know you haven't fully communicated your process when the client starts checking in to see how things are going between these touch points. So while each artist might have different takes on the process, there really are only two main stages, I think, that are universal to all illustrators, and these are sketches and finals. You'll hear me talking about these a lot in my videos. So sketches is when you share your first idea in rough form. Sometimes these are called roughs or concepts. And then finals or finished art is when you present the finalized, ready to go artwork based on the approved sketch. With these two stages clearly scheduled in, it will be easier to discuss revisions and navigate requests to see work in progress, which, as we'll see, is another point we're going to discuss. The third mistake illustrators make when working with clients is that they give too many options. So we tend to think that clients expect to see many options, like more than 3 or 4 or even beyond that. While the creative process does involve throwing a whole bunch of stuff to the wall and seeing what sticks, most of this idea generation should happen on our side without the client being involved. It's not in the client's best interest to see every good and bad idea that comes up in our process. I think it can be overwhelming for them. It's overwhelming enough for experienced creatives like us to sort through the early ideational work. And so if it's hard for us, think about how confusing it might be to someone who doesn't know how to read a sketch, say. So, another point is a client may not actually have much time to weigh in on our every possible idea. And I'll put this bluntly. I actually think that it's a discourtesy for creatives to present more than 3 options to our client for a given work or illustration. When we present our ideas to our clients, it should be on us to make sure our ideas solve the problem and do so with clarity. It should also be on us to come in with a strong recommendation. If we present more than just a few options, it signals we haven't quite figured things out ourselves. We're putting it onto our clients to decide for themselves what is best. While this might seem like a nice collaborative way of working with our clients and working out our ideas, it actually hurts the process. On our side, it weakens our position as the creative leaders. Showing lots of ideas might be impressive. We might impress our clients with how creative all of our ideas are, but it's not very authoritative. On the client side, they're suddenly tasked with a creative decision they may feel unqualified to make. This can be stressful where there are multiple options involved. A client may feel pressure to choose something even when they don't really know why or how it differs from the other available options. In his book, The Paradox of Choice, writer Barry Schwartz argues that eliminating consumer choices can greatly reduce anxiety for shoppers. So the paradox is in that, whereas we have all these choices, like you go to the grocery store and you have 14 different brands of soda, you'd think that having all those options would make the experience more satisfying in some way. But what happens is if we don't really know why we would choose one over the other, we end up regretting our choice, wondering if maybe one of the other options might have been better in the moment. Presenting too many options to our clients, especially when they're all plausible, might make it harder to choose any one of them. This is especially true if our options aren't distinct enough from one another. So remembering that our clients are usually part of a larger group of decision makers, each new option we present must get passed around and agreed on by everybody like in the organization. So the fewer options we present to our clients, the more productive the review process can be on their end. Limiting options is good for both client and artist. So yes, it makes our job easier. It means that we don't have to create 5 or 6 or even more different sketches, but it also ensures that each option we present will be stronger. We get permission to focus on 1, 2, or 3 of our best ideas rather than spreading ourselves thin across many more. It also takes the pressure off from having to share ideas we're not excited about. When we feel we have to make more options for the sake of options, we end up sharing ideas we might not actually like. In fact, I actually recommend that if you believe you've nailed it in just one sketch, if you really believe that, you should feel permitted to share only that option with your client. You can keep the other ones in your back pocket just in case. We have to ask ourselves, why are we presenting more than one option? Is it because we want to give the clients some agency in determining what's best for them? Do we want them to have the ability to weigh in at this early stage and feel like they're shaping the project? Or is it because we can't make up our own minds? The next mistake is allowing unlimited revisions. Now, I know this one is a huge pain point for many of us illustrators. So as you're defining the brief, and as you're preparing the quote, it's important to include how many revisions you'll include in the process. Revisions can go on longer than you want, and with each iteration, the project risks going further and further off track rather than getting closer to the goal. So what is a revision? A revision or revisions are changes that you make to your work in response to client feedback. Our goal when showing clients our work should be to get it right away, and for there to be no need for revisions. We should aim for that level of perfection. At the same time, we must be open to the fact that we're not perfect, and the client may not have perfectly expressed or understood their need before seeing our first sketch. So we must build in the opportunity to course correct along the way. Revisions happen really at the 2 key stages I mentioned before. So first in the sketches and then in the finals. Now, if you want revisions to happen anywhere, you definitely want them to happen at the sketches stage. It's always easier to make changes in pencil or roughs, and things feel less precious at this stage. It's an opportunity for the client to have their say on the concept, on the content, and the composition before you go and finalize everything in the next stage. By the time you're sharing finished art with your client, you don't want them wanting entirely new concepts or configurations. Reasonable changes at the final art stage would be in smaller details or small kind of shifts in scale and placement of elements in the composition. So like move this person just a little bit that way, or move this sun closer to the center. Those are the kind of changes you might see in the final stage. You need to be clear that you expect all major feedback to come at the sketches stage. The client should know what they'll be receiving at each stage and what kind of feedback they should be giving, if any, before approving the work. But more to my point, you need to be clear about how many revisions you'll allow at each stage. There should be a limit. I think 3 is a standard amount. If your client continues to ask for changes past the 3rd round, provided you're truly addressing their concerns each time, you should feel comfortable bringing this up. If there's a revision limit written into the agreement, there's nothing rude or awkward about flagging excessive rounds. The purpose of revisions is not just to protect you from having to work more than you hoped, but to help the client to take what you present to them more seriously. When there's a low cost to being sloppy, a client may not be diligent in reviewing what you've sent to them. They may skim through your sketches and miss out on certain important details. They might assume that if they miss something, they can just pick it up in the more finalized stage, where errors might be easier for them to spot. At the same time, having a few rounds of revisions leaves some wiggle room for not getting it quite right at first. In sending both our sketches and our final art, we want to do our best to get it right, but we shouldn't expect that we'll be perfect every time. The next mistake illustrators make when working with clients is presenting unfinished work. Sometimes a client wants a sneak peek at the work before we have full ideas at the sketch stage, or they want to see how the finals are coming along. While there are rare times when it's actually good to share work mid-process, especially if you and your client are sort of both creatives, you're maybe part of a creative team, it's usually a bad idea to share unresolved work. The problem with sharing work in progress, or sometimes people call it like WIP or WIP, is that it risks eliciting the wrong kind of feedback. Given that we ourselves are unsure of our progress in the messy middle, it can be more destructive than constructive to have our client weigh in at this stage. Perhaps not understanding that illustration has an awkward stage, they may actually recoil or be disappointed at what it looks like in its unfinished appearance. Our job as creative leaders is to assure the client and to give them confidence we're doing a good job. Just like we have to protect them from a dizzying array of options, we must also protect them from anything that might make them lose faith in us as experts. The existential burden of doubting ourselves and our work in the midst of an unresolved creative effort should always rest squarely on our shoulders. On a more practical side, sharing work in progress also muddies up the tidy revision counting we rely on to make sure the project stays on track. So what if a client wishes to see your work before you're ready? First, you can kind of prevent this whole scenario by being very clear about what the client will see when you're setting up the job. So if sneak peeks aren't part of your kind of clear touch points that you arranged or scheduled in, you're allowed to say so. One way to word this, so if a client comes and says, we just want to see how you're doing, can we get a glimpse of what you're doing? You could just kind of frame it in terms of wanting to bring your client your best and make sure they have something they can give kind of full and proper feedback on. So second, maybe there's a nice halfway solution. If you're working, say, on a series of illustrations, it's often a good thing for the client to see some of the set before you go and do the whole thing. In this situation, it actually makes sense to stage the project so that you provide one or two pilot illustrations, and then once those are approved, you can move into the rest of the set. This gives you a chance to work out how the set will look without having to do all of it. Even still, while you're presenting a part of a larger project in this way, you're not technically sharing work in progress. You would go through the sketching and final art stages of the illustration process for the pilots just as you would with any other project. So this next mistake is a huge pain point for many illustrators, and that's not getting on the same page about style. Whether you're just beginning or a seasoned illustrator, style will be an important part of the conversation. The client will have expectations for style, and so will you, so it's important to be on the same page about it. If you're just beginning, you may not have a fully developed style, which means style will be a more kind of pronounced part of the conversation. If you're more seasoned and you have an established and consistent style, there'll probably be less of a need to have this conversation because that's something the client has seen and probably why they came to you in the first place. In either case, it's important to bring it up at the beginning before you go into the project. Ask the client which pieces of your work, which of your work attracted them to you, and also ask about their creative vision or direction for the project in question. If the client doesn't seem to have a style preference, part of your job will be to tease out of them some clues. You want to get them thinking about it and avoid any kind of surprises later on. When you don't know what style to work in or what your client is expecting, there are two possible difficulties. So the first difficulty is that you might find yourself feeling uncertain of your approach as you go into the project. you'll lack that necessary confidence to come in with a strong recommendation. So not only are you trying to come up with good ideas, you're also scrambling to imagine what those ideas might look like in terms of style. You'll probably spend a lot of time looking through the work of others, perhaps on Pinterest, Dribbble, or Behance, and you'll be relying too much on the style and ideas of others rather than doing something more original. Well, sometimes a little inspiration hunting is just what the doctor ordered. There is that risk that none of the styles you latch onto are what the client is asking for. And worse yet, it's possible you won't be able to pull off someone else's style anyway. The second possible difficulty is that the client not having a clear idea of what style they're asking for, they won't be prepared for the style you present. So without a solid kind of picture of the style they want in mind, whatever you present to them might just kind of feel off base or unexpected. Whatever the case, not getting on the same page stylistically just makes it too easy for a misunderstanding to arise, usually when it's too late. So how do you get on the same page stylistically? It's simply by asking the client to point at certain works of yours that attracted them to you in the first place. But what if a client, say, sends you illustration references, like they'll send you other illustrators' work, and these aren't styles that you are known to work in? If you're kind of newer and you haven't quite figured out your style, you can see this as an opportunity to try something new anyway and get paid while doing it. And at least you can use it as a starting point for the conversation. And again, if you love these styles that they're showing you, it might just be the strongest start that you can have, provided you're not planning on outright copying someone else's style. If you're like most illustrators though, you'll want to have a go at doing something more original. You can ask your client how comfortable they are with you using their style reference as a loose direction, but with you providing something more in your own style. Chances are that's what they wanted anyway, but just be prepared for a little back and forth as you work out kind of what that style is in the middle of the project. I mean, I always talk about how you should always have a strong style to start with, and that way that just solves so many problems that come up down the road. I think having just one or two kind of styles that you become known for just makes your job as an illustrator more easy. When you're starting out, you just can't have it. You can't start out having a strong style. So you just need to be prepared for some growing pains while you're working out your style in the midst of making work for your clients. If you nor your client are certain about which style to work in, I highly recommend scheduling in what I call a style directions exercise. So this would be done at the very beginning of the project before you do any research or concepting or like making sketches. So here you'd put together 2 or 3 distinct style directions for the client to choose from. A style direction is it's a collection of images and sometimes colors and type samples, especially if you're a designer, that together show a clear stylistic vision. It's basically a mood board that you can show your client and you can say, I like these kinds of things and I would like to try them in what I'm gonna later make for you. Each direction would be like kind of on a single page or mood board. So these images would be sourced from a variety of illustrators to ensure that no single illustrator is being imitated. And then together, this kind of collection of different images will tell a story of the kind of textures, forms, shapes, people, and other stylistic or conceptual elements that you'd like to bring into the project. However you pitch a style, when it's up for discussion, it's important to discuss it early on and always with an eye to how style will serve the client's needs and fit under the roof of your artistic abilities and interests. The next mistake is sending work as loose email attachments. Imagine going to a restaurant where the chef serves food directly on the table without a plate. Imagine they just kind of throw the food on the table and then walk away. This is exactly what it's like when you send your work as loose attachments in email. This is in contrast to presenting your work in a proper deck like a presentation, with proper titling and descriptions to help sell and contextualize your ideas. As an art director who's hired other illustrators, I've seen this firsthand. To me, sending work as loose attachments devalues it and reflects poorly on the artist. It also makes it more difficult for clients to offer their feedback. When you present your work in a properly designed deck, your work is literally framed in a way that makes it seem more valuable. It's more than a throwaway idea. Sending your sketches in a deck says that you took time on it and you took care to place it nicely on a formatted page and to give it a description. Sharing your work in a well-labeled deck ensures that those reviewing it understand what it is and what they are to do with it. Imagine you send your work loose leaf in an email as just an attachment, and that gets shared around on the client side, around their organization. What if the sketches or artwork gets shared around without your little rationale that you sent in the email, if you sent one at all? Who's to say everyone will understand what they're looking at or what you intended? I think this would be an opportunity for ill-informed and very irritating feedback. Sharing your work in a deck gives you more control over how others are encountering your ideas, and therefore it elicits more pointed and useful feedback. Okay, the next mistake that illustrators make when working with clients is suggesting doubt about your work. I'll say that again. A big mistake when presenting your work to clients is suggesting your own doubts about what you're showing them. When presenting our work to our clients, particularly when we're sending our work by email, we may tend to say something like, hopefully this works for you, or let me know if you need any changes. What this suggests is that you're not certain you solved the problem. It might also suggest that the client is actually expected to come back with some kind of changes. This may subconsciously prompt your client to find things to nitpick about, or they may feel like they're supposed to ask for changes even if they don't have any. But maybe you actually nailed it, in which case, don't suggest that you didn't. Don't leave the door open to unnecessary doubt. Of course, we should leave room for being corrected or for the client to ask for some kind of adjustments. That's part of our job. But since we only send work we strongly believe in, right? We want to encourage the client to go with what we are sending. When I send my sketches by email, I usually write something like this. Hello client, I'm pleased to share with you my sketches. Here's a link to the file. Please let me know if you have any questions. Once approved, we can move this into final art. Thanks, Tom. And similarly, when I send my files, I'll write something like this. Hello client, I'm pleased to share with you the final art. Here's a link to the file. Please let me know if you have any questions. Once approved, I can send you the final high-res files. Thanks, Tom. You'll see that I remind the client that if the work is approved, we'll get to the next stage sooner. Implied here is that progress will happen more quickly if we can get an approval. I'm not hurrying anybody, and I'm not saying I'm above corrections or feedback. I'm simply giving a short reminder of how the process works. You'll also see that I don't apologize or explain much in my email. Any explanations are usually included in the deck, and since the deck might be shared around by many people internal to the organization, the deck ensures that those explanations will stay together with the work. Okay, so the next mistake illustrators make when working with clients is starting the actual work before the job has been made official. On a tight deadline, it may seem like you should get started on a project right away, even before all the things like the brief, the quote, and agreement are all set into place. But it's possible that your work will actually be for naught once all these things finally do come together. It's the client's responsibility to have a full brief and to supply you with everything you need to do your job first. Until you have an approved quote and an agreement of the scope and terms of the work, you should not feel pressured to jump the gun. If you feel the client is pressuring you to advance without these important things set in place, this might be a bad omen. Perhaps this client will have unreasonable expectations for you, which are against your values and policies. Particularly, they may be a bit pushy and impatient. Depending on the client and what they're paying you, you actually might be willing to loosen a few of your rules to accommodate their needs, but that should be your choice, and there should be a strong sense that the client does intend on tying up those loose ends without too much more delay. With larger clients, it's also possible that there's a lot of red tape to cut through and that it actually is more productive just to keep the ball rolling. I think a lot of larger magazines or big advertising agencies sometimes will have this kind of scenario, but always know that this comes with certain risks. It's always risky to start a job before you have all those first pieces set in place and signed off on. So whatever you do, just be sure that you don't make these your new rules. This could be an exception, not the rule. As we're going to see next, there should always be equal weight on both the artist and the client to fulfill their role in the relationship. If the client is expecting you to do anything that goes beyond reason or fairness, they're showing a lack of respect for you as a professional, independent freelancer. Remember, you're not their employee and they're not your boss. You guys are two businesses coming together on a common project. As your own business, you get to set your own policies in place, and insofar as they help you do the best job you can for your clients, you get to adhere to them. You get to play by your own rules. Okay, so the 10th mistake that you can make as an illustrator when working with clients is moving forward without client sign-off. One of the most important things about an illustration is it's a dialogue with give and take. You need to take things step by step and not get too far ahead without feedback on the client. For instance, it's very important that you get the client to sign off on a sketch before you can move it into finals. Similarly, it's important for your client to sign off on the quote in contract before you begin everything else. And we kind of hit on this in the last point. Each sign off is like a little contract that assures you that you've completed one stage and can go into the next one without having to go back. A sign off assures you that the client won't go back and change their mind. And if they do, it gives you permission to negotiate for additional budget. Requiring client sign off, particularly on sketches, will keep a project moving, especially when there's a deadline. As long as there's no sign off, the project remains at a standstill. This puts a little bit of pressure on the client to be thorough in their feedback and also prevents them from getting too carried away or from being indecisive. Asking for too many changes or being wishy-washy will cost them time, not you. And on this point, don't forget to factor in turnaround time between revisions and these different stages. So you don't want to have feedback or sign off on sketches at 10 p.m. Tuesday when the deadline for finals is the next morning. The next mistake illustrators make is skipping the sketches. This is an extension of the previous point, but deserves its own special mention. There's nothing less professional as an illustrator than sharing more finalized illustrations before doing more rough sketches. Sketches are a key way of making your client feel included in the process. Being able to see at least a few options if those are at all necessary, and being able to weigh in on these at this earlier stage gives clients a sense of agency and influence over the creative work. Jumping right into more final illustrations can catch clients off guard and can also come across as arrogant. Sketches are also a way for you to work out your ideas before committing them in a more finalized version. If you find it easier to work out your ideas in a more finished illustration, you're probably not alone, but in such a case, it often makes sense to reverse engineer a sketch from that final and then present that to your client. So actually literally trace over your more finished looking illustration that you made and that you're kind of happy with, and make it look like a loose sketch first and show that to your client. It will be more comfortable for the client then to give feedback on this rough sketch than something that felt like you spent too much time on, felt more precious. It will also make you look more like a pro. The 12th mistake is sending final files too soon. We've discussed clearly staging our process, limiting revisions, and not sending loose work. And now we've discussed not advancing to the next stage without approval of the one you're currently on. This point here is similar but important enough to address as its own point. One of the reasons we should send our work in a deck is that it requires action on their part, usually some kind of feedback or an approval. If the client sees our final art for the first time and it's just kind of this loose file, they may see this as ready to go. They may even just throw that file that you send them into the final design and forget all about you. We should never release final high-res files to the client without first receiving their full approval. One main reason is that they may decide they want changes after we thought we were finished the job, and that's a very frustrating place to be. If we send a loose final file to the client, it's harder to keep track of revisions as well, since the file wouldn't have a version number clearly stamped on it in the way that you can with a deck. So in the same vein, if you send this final file loose, that may signal to the client that you believe your job is done and therefore are closed to any more changes. This puts the client in an uncomfortable position if they do have any changes. Bluntly, I think there's a certain arrogance about sending the files without client sign-off on the final artwork first. I've said that the illustration process has these two main stages, sketches and final art, but there is a third step which I would call delivery. After the client approves the final art, we can then go in and clean up the file and make it ready to use for the client or whomever will end up receiving the final file to place wherever it ends up. So once we've cleaned up the file, then we can send it to the client using some kind of cloud-based file sharing service. This process of preparing the file for final use and uploading it to the cloud takes time. We don't want to have to do it more than once. This is another reason why the client needs to sign off on the final art as presented in the deck before we send them any files. Okay, so we're almost through, 2 more to go. Number 13 is accepting every job. Ideally, we should be very selective about which jobs we take on. We should prioritize fit over profit. Every time we take work we're not excited about, that's time and energy we could be spending on something we actually want to do. So I get it, like there's times when we have to take what we can get, and especially if we're starting out, we actually can't be that choosy. But as much as possible, we need to have a strong sense of who we are as artists and the kind of work we want to do, and then stick with it. Entering into a client-illustrator relationship is kind of like dating. So imagine someone who is so desperate for companionship that they dated everyone who came their way, even when they weren't all that attracted to them. So this person may never be lonely, but I don't think they're going to be very happy. They may even endanger themselves. Like, not all company is good company, right? A more healthy situation would involve 2 individuals who respect one another, but they're also independently whole. They don't need anyone else. The act of coming together is based on a mutual desire and respect, not on an imbalanced or codependent condition. So I'm talking about illustration here. We know how important it is to have standards when looking for mates and dates. If we're aiming to be illustrators, we're probably in it because we want to actually enjoy our career. It's not about quantity, but about quality. One of the key ways to ensure an enjoyable career is by valuing fit over profit. I've turned down good opportunities many times in my career. When I perceive that what the client wants or who they are and what I want and who I am are different, I'd rather lose out on a bit of profit than suffer through a project I'm just not that into. I'm not afraid of missing out. In fact, by actively rejecting the wrong opportunities, I'm actively setting myself up for the right ones. I'm not saying I don't make compromises. There are times when you have to take the good you have and not hold out for some imaginary better. But we have to have a standard to hold all of our opportunities against. That's how we get better while getting better opportunities. Okay, so the last mistake, number 14, is accepting vague direction and feedback. We should never feel like we have to read our clients' minds. If we don't know something and that something can't be found out from anyone other than our client, we've got to ask them. If the client is giving us an incomplete brief, it's on us to guide them into filling in the blanks. If in their feedback they're not being clear about what they want, we need to lead them to more specificity. I sense that many illustrators tolerate vagueness and a lack of clarity from their clients, and that they suffer for it. Perhaps we fear that if we ask too many questions, we'll appear too unprofessional. I suspect that if you're a beginner, not knowing all there is to know about the process, you might assume that you need to figure out absolutely everything out on your own. Don't wait until you've done all the hard work in sketches or finals to learn what your client really wants or meant. We need to help them define things like the problem, purpose, needs, and all those kinds of things in the very beginning. And when they tell us there's something wrong with our work, which is fair, we need to ask them what and why. If a client says, "This isn't working for me," that's common but not very sufficient feedback. You can respond by asking, "What's not working?" If they say, "I don't like that green," you can just ask them to elaborate. Maybe you want to specify what kind of green will work, or is it all greens? You just want to dig deep and find out what they really mean. Questions like these will give the client an opportunity to really think through their reasoning and perhaps give you more helpful direction moving forward. It's not always the client's fault that they're giving you this loose, vague feedback. Sometimes it doesn't occur to clients to tell us what they really need or what their preferences are until they see something they don't like. So this happens, it happens all the time. Our job is to make sure we get our clients to say what they are thinking and to say what they mean and to get at the root of what we're being asked to do. That's our job. As creative leaders, we should become good at interpreting feedback and applying it thoughtfully in our work. Our job is not simply to do what we're told, but to understand the real need behind the demand and to see how we can address it from a place of strength. So let's just wrap it up here. Let's just be honest. Most of us get into illustration because we want to make art for a living. Few of us get into it because we want to work with clients or run a business. But whether we like it or not, running a business and working for and with clients is as much a part of the job as the art itself. Artists that we are, I know that we make that mistake of seeing clients as obstacles who are getting in the way of our creativity rather than being the reason for our creativity. But we have to acknowledge that working with our clients is the only way to make good commercial art. The better we are at working with clients, the better our work will be. Clients are not the enemy. That being said, learning to work with clients as artists is a bit of an art in itself. It's possible to be an excellent illustrator, but not so good with clients. If we ever feel our best ideas are being sabotaged, it's entirely likely that it's more about how we set up the client relationship from the beginning and how we stick to the script the whole way through. Even a mediocre illustrator can enjoy a long and successful career if they can figure out the client and business part. All right, everyone, that's it. 14 mistakes illustrators make when working with clients. So now I'll just push the question over to you guys. What has been your experience working with clients? What are your pain points? What are the things that you get stuck on? Can you tell us any stories about mistakes that you've made and what you learned from them? Please leave your answer down in the comments. I always love your comments and I try to respond to everyone as soon as I can. As always, please hit that like button if you enjoyed this video or got a lot out of it. And if you want to know when new videos pop up, hit that subscribe button, hit that bell, and you know the deal. My name's Tom Froese. You can catch me at tomfroese.com. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.